Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, whichever it is for you. My name is Jeff, and I'm going to be introducing our study for the next week ahead in the Immerse series. We'll be looking at the book of Hebrews and the book of James. So just wanted to give a little background and a little bit overview of those two books as we get started this week. So thanks for joining us. I wanted to start off the way the Immerse authors started off in their explanation by reading a couple verses from Hebrews. And you'll see this in your books on page 367 if you want to look at these verses, which come from the end of Hebrews, but also in their beginning. Think back on those early days when you first learned about Christ. Remember how you remained faithful, even though it meant terrible suffering. ... A few verses later, remember those in prison, as if you were there yourself. Remember also those being mistreated, as if you felt their pain in your own bodies. In our current world, that is dealing with racial and political unrest and injustice, remembering what it is like to be mistreated or jailed and imprisoned, remember it as if you felt it in your own body. That's some pretty heavy empathetic work right there. And I think it's work that would be worth doing for all of us, not only in our current time, but probably just as a model throughout our lives. So I want to join with the author of Hebrews in imploring us to live empathetically, imagining what it's like for our brothers and sisters who deal with injustice, mistreatment, being in jail, being in prison. We don't know the author of the book of Hebrews as I transition. We can make assumptions, and many people have made guesses, but it doesn't sound like it's any of the authors that we know from the other letters or books in the Bible. It doesn't sound like John or Peter or Paul, Matthew, Mark, not so much. Doesn't sound like Luke. It's a very different kind of style. If I had to throw my 2 cents in, Bartholomew might be somebody I would think of, but it could be anybody. Whoever it is, they have a very good understanding of the story of the Israelite people. They understand or they know of the Old Testament as we see it, or the Hebrew Scriptures. The author does an amazing job of really telling the narrative story of Israel, and all the while telling and showing how Christ is the culmination of God's work. God's work started in creation. God's work started in Abraham, Moses, throughout the Old Testament heroes of faith. But people often point to, when they're talking about the book of Hebrews, how Christ is the culmination of those things, or Christ is greater than the angels, greater than the prophets, greater than the Mosaic law, and those patriarchs, Abraham, Moses, and others, who in some ways initiated God's work, or allowed God to initiate his work through them. And so in Hebrews, we see the author trying to get his audience to really understand who Christ is. And in a very different way, very different narrative way, similar kind of end point maybe as the Gospel of John, trying to see Jesus as transcending this Jewish individual, Jesus of Nazareth, but transcending into the Messiah for all people, and the Christ for a movement that goes beyond the Mosaic law, or goes beyond the tradition of the Jewish elders, or goes beyond Judaism. Not that it throws it away, not that it leaves it behind, but transcends it and maybe goes beyond. And one of the ways that the author does this is he brings up this character, Melchizedek. Melchizedek, we learn, is a priest, a king who blesses Abram at that time, in the book of Genesis. And we don't know much about Melchizedek, but the Hebrew author brings him out to show that Jesus is this kind of prophet, priest, king that in many ways predates Israel. One who blesses Israel, but is beyond just the Israelite story of Abraham through the prophets, through the time of the Second Temple. the time of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. Connecting Jesus to Melchizedek kind of gives us a broader sense maybe of who Jesus is, or encourages the readers, the first readers of Hebrews, to have a better sense, a wider sense of who Jesus is, not merely a Jewish prophet to fulfill the law, but somebody who's transcending it, moving beyond and moving with. So that's kind of what I'll tell you about Hebrews. Encourage you to read it and see the whole story fleshed out. The segue to the book of James comes from the end of Hebrews. My segue, as I'm trying to segue into the book of James, is that Hebrews says towards the end, the last chapter, and don't forget to do good and to share with those in need. These are the sacrifices that please God. There are many sacrifices that were required in the Jewish law that became customary. And Hebrews is trying to transition the people, because it was written to mostly Jews, out of that framework of the sacrificial system into doing good to your neighbors. And James takes us even further. James is a book very much in the same kind of vein or same line as some of the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. It's kind of our New Testament wisdom book, so to speak. And it's a book about this is what you should do. So now that you're a follower of Christ, do these things. Martin Luther, the famous reformer, back in the 1500s, 1600s, was famous for his latching on to Paul's idea of grace through faith. A very simple idea that gave Martin Luther a lot of freedom and a lot of security and a lot of hope for his faith. Unfortunately for the Protestant Reformation, and fortunately for Martin Luther, he had a very difficult time with the book of James because the book of James impressed upon works. And that's an unfortunate thing, because James is not necessarily opposed to faith and grace, or grace by faith, but James is taking us to a point of saying, well, what now? So now that we're saved by grace through faith, it was all Christ's work. What about now? What do we do now? If you were a good Jewish person, you would continue in the Jewish traditions. You would continue in maybe the sacrificial system. But probably a lot of Jews, once the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, also had to ask that question. What do we do now? How do we carry on this religion, this tradition? And for James, speaking to those who were followers of Jesus, it was pretty simple. He said things like, take care of the orphans and the widows. Tame your tongue. Be slow to anger. Be slow to speak. Be quick to listen. Rejoice when you're suffering certain trials. And many other things, several other things, of wise kind of encouragements, kind of upside down things that were similar to what Jesus said when Jesus gave us the golden rule of loving your neighbor as yourself. And James gives us practical ideas in order to do that. So as you read the book of James, it's not particularly hard to figure out. It's not particularly complicated. But it can be uncomfortable. And it can, at times, hit us where we live, so to speak. It may be very easy for us to do certain things, for some of us to tame our tongues, for some of us to be slow to anger. And those things may be very difficult for others of us. It may be very hard to take care of others, orphans and widows. It might be right up somebody else's alley, but difficult for us. So James at times will challenge us. But he keeps it pretty simple. So don't make it overcomplicated, but allow yourself to be uncomfortable. And expect to hear the words of Jesus coming through the book of James. So thanks for letting me share with you, and blessings to you as you read these two letters. Thank you.